Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip has to do with due diligence period, repairs, and best practices to work through all of that stuff, as well as a couple of comments regarding the time frames that you need to stay cognizant of. So let's back up. I have done several videos on due diligence, but it continues to come up as an issue. So I want to just go over a couple of things and give you guys a couple of tips and tricks for best practices when interacting, especially with a buyer during a due diligence period. So first and foremost, what is a due diligence period? A due diligence period is only an option for a buyer, and it is a buyer's right to terminate the contract for any or no reason, as long as they terminate, send notice of termination, and or terminate and send notice of that termination to the seller prior to the end of that time frame. That's all it is. And so there are a lot of things that a buyer is going to do to help them make the decision if they're going to terminate or stay in the contract. But before I get to that, let's look at the form. So in the GAR Purchase and Sale Agreement, which is Form F201, this is all spelled out in paragraph A8 and B8. Specifically, B8D is where it goes on that the property is being sold as is unless it's subject to due diligence period. And in general, it just says that the due diligence period is the time frame for the buyer to decide to proceed or not proceed with the purchase of the property for any or no reason. And again, it goes on, paragraph 2, purpose of the due diligence period. During the due diligence period, buyer may determine whether or not to proceed with the option to proceed or not. In the RE forms contract package, it is spelled out in the actual purchase and sale agreement in paragraph 6.1, buyer's general right to terminate period, and it is further explained in the RE standard terms, which is RE1, buyer's general right to terminate. Again, it goes on and on to say that the buyer's right to, the due diligence period or buyer's right to terminate is exactly that. It is a buyer right to terminate. Not a seller's right to terminate, but a buyer's right to terminate for any or no reason. So if a buyer is going to terminate based on the due diligence, that's all you need to fill out, is they're terminating based on due diligence. You don't need to go into any further explanation. It's just that they're doing so within that right to do so in the time frame. So what does a buyer do to figure out, are they going to exercise their option to terminate or go on with the contract and go to closing? Well, there's all kinds of things a buyer can do. A buyer may have an independent home inspection by an inspector of their choice. They can check out the roof. They can check out the structure. They can see if there's any termites. They can make sure that the property is zoned for the way they think it's zoned. They can make sure it's in the school district. They can have a survey done of the property. They can make sure they're going to keep their job. They can make sure their children like it, their parents like it, their significant other likes it. They can check out the commute time to work. They can do whatever. This is their time frame to make sure that if they're going to go figure out if they're going to go through with the contract or terminate. Now, throughout the course of this time frame, the buyer every now and then might find something that they want the seller to address, namely repairs. There might be some repairs that the buyer says, hey, I'm trying to figure out if I'm going to terminate or not. I found some issues. I'm wondering if seller, if you'd be willing to address these concerns or not. So in the GAR contract package, there is an amendment, and it is amendment F704, amendment to address concerns with the property. In the RE forms contract package, it is the RE 262 amendment during buyer's right to terminate. Now, there are some other issues on that amendment, but one of the important things that I want to let you know, in the GAR amendment, F704, amendment to address concerns with the property, this is the only amendment in the GAR contract package that has a time limit on there. And what it says, this got changed last year in 2020, and basically what it says, this amendment is intended to set forth the agreement of the parties relative to concerns raised by the buyer during the due diligence time period. If this amendment does not become effective during the due diligence period, it shall become null and void and of no legal force and effect. What on earth does all of that mean? That means that if a buyer initiates this amendment to address concerns with the seller, if you do not have this amendment with both buyer and seller signatures agreeing to everything on there before the end of the due diligence period, then anything on this amendment is no longer part of the contract. So this is a couple of things. Number one, if the buyer initiates an amendment to address concerns with the seller, and the seller initiates a counter amendment back to the buyer saying, okay, let's say the buyer says, I want you to do A, B, C, and D. And the seller says, no, I'll do A and B, but not C and D. And the buyer goes back and says, no, I want you to do A and D, not B and C. And the seller sends back an amendment saying, I'll do C, and that's it. Regardless, you get the point. Negotiating back and forth on these issues, repair issues, for the that the buyer and the seller negotiate for the seller to complete. If whatever gets negotiated, if you do not have their agreement on this document, this is just the amendment to address concerns, and it is F704. If you don't have both buyer and seller signatures with notice to the other party on this prior to the end of due diligence period, then this amendment is no longer part of the contract. So a couple of things that means. Number one, if the buyer and the seller are still willing to negotiate through these repair issues, but you're getting ready to come to past the due diligence period, all of this needs to be done on a general amendment, not this amendment. This amendment is no longer part of the contract if it's not signed with notice of signatures sent to both parties before the end of due diligence. That's number one. Number two, you buyer's agents. If a buyer initiates this amendment to the seller, amendment to address concerns, and you don't hear back from the seller, that does not extend the due diligence period. The due diligence period is a hard deadline under which or before which the buyer must decide if I'm going to terminate or not. The only way to extend the due diligence period is by amendment. Once that time frame has been negotiated by a buyer and a seller on a purchase and sale agreement, the only way to extend it is by amendment. Now, GAR has a form F710, amendment to the due diligence period, to extend it. If you are on the RE forms, then you're just going to use a general amendment, RE 261, amendment to the contract. Again, that is the only way to extend a buyer's due diligence period once you're under a binding contract, is by an amendment with mutual agreement between the buyer and the seller. Additionally, if a buyer has not yet sent the earnest money, that does not extend due diligence period. And if a buyer goes in with 0 days due diligence period and terminates before they send in the earnest money, they still owe that earnest money to the seller as liquidated damages. Just because they haven't sent in the earnest money doesn't mean it's not part of the contract, and does not mean that they have due diligence rights if they put in 0 days in the contract. So what are some best practices for your buyers when negotiating with the seller for items to address with the property, specifically repairs? I strongly suggest as a broker that the best way to work through this between a buyer and a seller would be to handle it financially. Rather than asking the seller to hire vendors to get the repair work done, replacements, so forth and so on. You always have an issue when a buyer is buying a house and they ask the seller to take care of repairs. How the seller does them versus how a buyer would do them for themselves tends to be an issue. Not always, but best practice would be to handle this financially. You can handle it a couple of ways. You could either handle it by negotiating a reduction in the sale price. You can handle it by having the seller make a bigger contribution to the buyer's closing costs. Another way to handle it would be to do a special stipulation, or actually we're not a special stipulation at this point, but to do an amendment that would state at closing, from seller's proceeds, seller to pay whatever vendor or buyer's choice, X amount of dollars, and just leave it at that. So a couple of things if you're doing this. If you are negotiating from the sale price, then if you are using the GAR contract forms package, you would use Form F713, Amendment to Sale Price, and you just put in a new sale price. Or you could just use a general amendment to the contract. If you're using the RE forms, you would use a general amendment to the contract. You're not going to put in the words in lieu of repairs because this is just a negotiation between the buyer and the seller. And if you put in lieu of repairs, then a lender, if there's an FHA or VA loan, some of those issues are addressed potentially by the appraiser. But in a conventional loan, a conventional lender, you might cause problems with the loan. So best practices, couple of things. Number one, you buyer's agents, the due diligence, buyer's right to terminate time frame is a hard and fast time frame. An outstanding amendment that has not yet been negotiated, earnest money not being turned in or sent to the holder, none of those things extend that time frame. That is the time frame within which a buyer decides, am I going to terminate this contract and get my earnest money back, or am I going to go through with the contract? And if nothing has been agreed upon, then the buyers need to realize they're purchasing the property as is. There is no more incentive for a seller to address any repair issues with a property after the end of the due diligence period. So number one, nothing extends it except for agreement between the buyer and the seller on some sort of amendment. Number two, if you do negotiate between for repairs between a buyer and a seller, if you are using the GAR Amendment to Address Concerns, again, you need to keep track of your time frames. Best way, now, after you pass the due diligence period, that's not to say a buyer and a seller can't still negotiate through repair items. It would just have to be done on a general amendment. Best way to handle repair issues by far to avoid the fewest misunderstandings would be financially, whether it be a reduction in sale price, additional contribution to closing costs, or a seller paying a vendor at closing from their proceeds, vendor of the buyer's choice, because that is not going to affect the buyer's loan because it doesn't affect the buyer. The money is going directly from the seller to a vendor. So I hope this contract tip helped you out. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.